Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Chris and today we are out in my backyard and we're going to talk about location and space. This is video number 2 in my series on what I think is most important when you're planting a garden. When I talk about location, I'm going to talk about the actual place that you put your garden in. And when I talk about space, I'm referring to how much area you're planting in. When you're deciding on the location of your garden, the number one thing to keep in mind is how much sun and how much shade does that space get during the day. This is a very important factor that will help you determine where the best location is, with keeping in mind what you want to grow. There's also the consideration that your space might get too much sun. If you live in a really hot climate, you want your plants, regardless of what type they are, to have some kind of reprieve from the high heat of the sun in the later day. Even our heat-loving plants can get too much sun. So those are important considerations when you are looking at the location that you're choosing for your garden. The next really important consideration as far as location goes is how easily accessible is it? You don't want to place your garden somewhere kind of far away from your house where it's not very convenient for you. The phrase out of sight, out of mind is definitely applicable in that situation. If you place your garden where you're not going to see it and where it's less convenient for you to get to it, then chances are you're just going to let it sit and you're not going to pay as much attention to it as you should. So make sure when you're choosing a location, not only are you looking at how much sun the location gets, but also look at if that is a convenient spot for you. Also look at if that's a convenient spot for you to access on a regular basis. You also want to take into consideration water sources. So every garden is going to need a water source. It's going to need to be watered. Unless you live in a climate where you get plenty of water, that your garden doesn't need to be supplemented with water, then you're going to need to think about where water is relative to where you're placing your garden. It's also important to think about how you're going to water. Are you going to set up an irrigation system, or are you going to water with a hose? Are you going to collect rainwater, or do you need to run it from a faucet? Water is extremely important for the garden, so that is a huge thing that you want to consider. When you're picking the location for your garden, you're also going to want to think about what type of garden you're planning to have. What are you going to grow in that garden? How are you going to grow it in that garden? Are you going to plant it in the ground? Are you going to use raised beds? Or maybe you're going to use containers instead. Those types of things can alter where you choose your location. If you're going to plant in the ground, then your options are probably a little bit more limited than if you are going to use a raised bed, which gives you a little bit more options because then you don't have to worry so much about the soil in the ground. And if you're using a container, then you have an even wider range of choices because maybe you can even put that container on a deck that's right outside of your window. It's also important to consider what you're going to grow as well. So if you're growing things that you're going to harvest from on a fairly regular basis, like daily or even every other day, you're going to want those things closer to your house because that's the easiest place to get to them. If you're having to go a ways to pick your lettuce or spinach greens or something like that, and you're having to walk out way into a crop garden that's not very convenient, then chances are good you're probably not going to use those very much. Just because, we're all busy, convenience is a real thing in our lives today. Putting those things a little bit closer to your house and to where they're easily accessible, it's going to create a space where those particular vegetables are going to be in a space that's very easy for you to use. And in turn, that's going to allow you to use them on a much more regular basis. Versus a crop garden where maybe you might go out there once a week, or there are some crops where you might just let them go and you're only harvesting a couple of times at the end of the season. Those types of crops, it's a lot easier to put them a little bit further away because you don't have to visit them nearly as often. Now let's talk about space. Space is equally important because you need to be able to fit your garden into the space that you have available. If you have acreage where you can dedicate a quarter of an acre to a garden, then you have a much larger space to plant your garden and what kind of varieties you're going to plant in that garden. If you're in a more suburban or urban area like I am, then your space might be a lot more limited. So behind me, this is my entire backyard. It's not very big, so my space available to me to garden isn't that much. It's definitely not nearly as big as I wish it was, but I like to think that I've gotten a little bit creative with the space that I have, and it's really important that you get a little creative. It's also important to take the space that you have and try to maximize it for best use. If you're in an apartment situation where all you have is a patio, planting something that's really big that might take up that entire space might not be the best choice for the area that you have. If you have a much larger space, then you can probably grow several different types of winter squashes and pole beans and all of these things that tend to get really large. There are other things you can do to maximize your space if you have a smaller amount of space, like a patio, or even a small yard like me. Or maybe you don't have a small amount of space, but you want to kind of increase space that is maybe closer to your house, where you don't have a nice big plot of land that you can plant a garden in. One thing that I learned to maximize my space last year was to grow vertically. Now this isn't a new concept at all. I had known about it, but I hadn't really employed it very well. So last year was my first year that I decided to start using green stalks, and I can tell you I am so happy that I did. They did fantastic, and I was able to grow so much more food than I had ever grown before. Not only that, I was able to grow it very close to my house. So this is my back door right here, and I have green stalk number 1, green stalk number 2, and just around the corner I have a couple more green stalks. I have a few more that I got over the course of the winter through their Black Friday sale that I'm planning to put on this deck as well. So one of my big major problems with space is that I have to share it. I have these furry little creatures. They like to play and run, and they need space to do that. So I have to share the small amount of space that I have with them so that they can still get their energy out and they can play and do those things that dogs do. So those are just a few things to consider when planning where you're going to put your garden. If you haven't seen my first video in this series on the difference between a growing zone and a growing season, I will link that video down below. And make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss my next video in the series. I thank you so much for joining me on this very cold and frosty Pacific Northwest morning. I hope to see you next time.